first Animal Advocacy Camp. It's really great to be the first speaker today. So one of the reasons why I'm so excited to be here is that Canada has relatively few gatherings where we all get together like this and brainstorm ideas to help animals better. It's pretty common in the United States. I know that they have conferences, and I think a number of you have actually been down to the Animal Rights Conference and to other conventions that they've held to discuss animal issues in the States, but it's not something that Canada has really done so much yet. So I hope this is the start of a new trend where we are able to get together more, develop friendships, discuss strategies, learn from each other, and be more collaborative. I think these gatherings like this are just super crucial to the work that we do to protect animals because we need to be coordinated to be effective. So we just haven't had a culture of collaboration, I think, in the way that the States have yet. We've had a few smaller conferences. I know there's one at Brock University that happens usually every year, but it's less focused on campaigning, I think, and more focused on thinking about animal issues in other ways. And I've been to a couple animal law conferences in Canada, but I think this is one of the very first activism-focused conferences. So it's exciting to be here. I think another difference between Canada and the States is that there's less awareness about animal issues, and we have fewer established national-type organizations that have been working on these issues for a long time. But today I'm going to talk to you about another key difference I see in the landscape between what we have here in Canada and what they have in the States. And that key difference is that animal advocates in the States have focused a lot more resources and energy on political lobbying and campaigning than we have in Canada. So what I really want to talk to you about is using the political system to get the type of changes that we want for animals in Canada. I think it's high time that the animal rights movement in Canada gets political. I know some of us have been doing some political work, but I think that there's a lot more that can be done. And it's a really important piece of the puzzle. So changing laws, I think, is one of the best ways to get formalized and long-lasting changes in society. And it also signals from the government that animal issues deserve to be taken seriously. So in this talk, I want to cover kind of three separate bases. First, I'm going to talk about why political lobbying and campaigning I think is so crucial to our movement. And second, I want to talk about the different levels of government in Canada and what they can each do in terms of passing laws and legislation to help animals and kind of what their responsibilities are. And third, I'm going to talk about how animal advocates have gone about doing some of this work in the past, how we could apply it in Canada, what kind of victories we've had before, and offer some practical tips to get this done. So how do you actually go about lobbying? What are the mechanics of it? So I anticipate talking for about 30 minutes, and then I thought we'd open it up for questions, discussion, or whatever you guys want. So to get back to the very basics of this, I think that we can all agree that the reason that we're here in this room is that we want social change. We want social change to protect animals. Right now we live in a world that just simply doesn't think twice about the way we treat animals. We eat 10 billion of them per year. We use them in countless other ways for research, for entertainment, for clothing. And what each of us wants is a world where animals are treated with the respect that they deserve by virtue of their status as sentient living beings. So clearly we need to bring about social change. And we have a number of tools in our kit with which to use to bring about this type of change. And animal advocates focus on various different areas. So for example, there's direct on-the-ground work that helps animals, such as sheltering, rescuing, spaying and neuter clinics, and so on. And this type of work is obviously super gratifying because you see an immediate difference in the lives of animals right away. So here's one tool we have. A second thing that we can work to do is to change societal attitudes. And I think that this is where most of the effort in Canada is focused. So we do things like holding a demo outside the department store on National Anti-Fur Day. And we pass out literature to passersby, we use the media to get out our message. And our message is that people should stop wearing fur because it's cruel to animals. So we might run billboards ads that challenge people as to whether it's okay to eat pigs but not dogs. So all of these efforts really contribute to raising public awareness about the issues, encouraging people to think in different ways, and hopefully encouraging them to eventually change their behavior. And this, of course, makes a difference to the animals. And another thing we can do is work to change corporate purchasing and other policies. So some organizations in the US have had a lot of success with this approach. For example, Mercy for Animals, PETA, the Humane Society of the United States, they've all struck major deals with food production companies that use animals in various ways. A good example of this is a recent Mercy for Animals undercover investigation of Sparbo farms. I'm not sure if any of you have seen the footage of this online, but it was back in the fall and they did an investigation into some of the practices at a chicken farm. And Sparbo farms happened to supply McDonald's with the eggs they use for their Egg McMuffins. And once this footage came to light, McDonald's dropped them as a supplier right away. So changing corporate purchasing policies, another great way to do something for animals. But finally, we come to legislation. And this is where we actually get new laws to protect animals and improve life for them. And I think this is an area that we need to shift increasing focus toward because this change is permanent. So these are all obviously really critical pieces of the puzzle, and they work together, certainly. For example, you need to change public attitudes to the point where politicians feel free to pass new laws, because governments simply can't impose changes if society really isn't ready. So in that sense, the public education works really well hand in hand with the legislative work that we do to get better laws. So they need to work in tandem. But I think legislation is one of the best approaches to bringing about lasting change and permanent change. And it's a great way to ensure that people don't slip back into their old habits. So why is this? There's a few reasons, I think. First of all, shutting down markets for certain products won't necessarily last forever. So shutting down markets is something we, I think, attempt to do when we try to change public attitudes. If we convince consumers to stop buying something like veal or foie gras, that's great for a period of time. The market shifts down, fewer restaurants sell those products, and as a result, there's less production and fewer animals suffer. But the problem with this approach, one issue, is that it leaves the animals vulnerable to ramping up of production if societal attitudes shift back towards the idea that it's more acceptable to eat veal or foie gras. And we see this all the time, I think. We'll go through phases where it is less acceptable to do such and such a thing, such as wear fur, and then it comes back with a vengeance. And so, we've really got these waves of support going on. So one example of this is the seal hunt. In the late 80s and 90s, there was a period where the seal hunt was much less than it has been in recent years. Fewer animals were slaughtered, and in part this had to do with shutting down markets and people finding it less acceptable to wear fur. But then the government and the fur industry came along, started increasing subsidies towards sealers and promoting the idea that fur was acceptable to wear, and the seal hunt starts to ramp up again. And so in the late 90s, we saw more seals being killed than ever before. So this is an example, I think, of where shutting markets down did leave us vulnerable to not really, solving the problem completely, because it was susceptible to societal attitudes. Another example is from the world of companion animals. So we can convince more and more people to adopt companion animals from shelters instead of purchasing them from pet stores, but we're never going to reach everyone, and that's the problem. There are always people out there who want to visit a breeder and who just walk by the pet store window and find that puppy so cute that they can't resist. So if we bring about legislation to prevent the sale of puppies and kittens in pet stores, for example, then we're doing more for the animals. So I think the take-home message from what I'm trying to tell you is that legislation really increases the permanence of any changes that we can bring about for the animals. So this is one reason why I think we should devote some of our attention towards this goal. Now, a second reason why I think it's important to actually get laws is that the payoff that we invest in terms of getting those laws and the time and energy we work on those things, the payoff is often greater than if we're simply attempting to change societal attitudes. We might get better results for animals if we try to do more than simply raise awareness. So let me give an example of this. Let me use circus protests as an example. We spend a lot of time organizing protests when circuses come to town, and they come back every year. And every year we get out there and we hold a demo and we tell people why it's wrong to support circuses and how animals are abused, how elephants are abused using bullhooks, and so on. But every year the circuses come back and they continue to abuse animals. But if we were to devote a little bit of this time that we spend holding demos in front of the circus towards getting long-term lasting legislation to prevent animal acts from being used in circuses, the payoff for animals could be a lot greater potentially than it would be if we simply attempt to raise public awareness about the issue. We would have to reach simply too many people through market demand in terms of shutting down the circus. So, we can tell people why the circus is unacceptable, but there are always going to be those holdouts who continue to go. And I think if we look at the history of this campaign, it shows that people simply aren't going to stop attending the circus. So this might be an example of one area where just investing a bit more time in trying to get laws to prevent animal acts from being used in circuses can have an extremely beneficial effect for the animals. And third, it's pretty effective when we actually do get legislation. It's less likely that legislation will be repealed. Usually when something is in place, it tends to stay in place, not always, but there's a certain kind of inertia and that the momentum doesn't really shift towards removing laws once they're in place. So if we're able to get good laws on the books for animals, it's highly effective and it actually works. And what we have on our side is essentially public opinion in a lot of cases. In a really general sense, everyone professes to care about animals. Now, whether they act in accordance with what they say they feel is another issue, and we'll leave that aside for a moment. But the bottom line is that people do care, and when animal advocates are able to show politicians that the public cares, we have good success in getting new and improved laws. So in the second part, I want to talk a little bit about the different levels of government and the practicalities of campaigning. So I'm going to start by just laying out a little bit about the powers that each levels of government possess. And some of you may already know this, so I apologize if it's repetitive, but I know it's new to many other people. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this and give an overview of what the different levels of government can actually do. And the reason this is important is because if we want to get a change implemented, we essentially have to know who is best to ask for that change. So let's start with the federal government. Essentially, they can pass laws that relate to areas of general national concern. So in practice, what this means essentially is a few main areas. First, there's the criminal code. So the federal government can make laws that prohibit cruelty to animals, and there'd be criminal sanctions attached to this. And if you are found guilty of one of these crimes, you have an actual criminal record. So it's pretty much the harshest type of sanction that can be imposed for animal abuse. International trade is another important area. They can regulate imports into Canada and products that we export from Canada. And this is important to animals for a couple of reasons. So first of all, on the import side, the federal government can limit what we bring into the country. For example, there's an NDP member of parliament, actually from British Columbia here, named Finn Donnelly, and he's put forward a bill to ban the importation of shark fin products into Canada. So if this passes, it'll be great for the sharks because it helps prevent people here from eating shark fin soup, obviously, and helps shut down the global trade in shark fin products. So this is one way of just cutting off the supply, basically, to people here. And on the export side, that can be important as well. So probably a lot of you know that oftentimes American tourists will come up to Canada, head to the Arctic, shoot polar bears, and bring them back to the States as trophies. If the Canadian government were to prohibit this practice and prevent polar bear pelts shot for trophies from leaving the country, then we would be shutting off a major reason for them to kill the animals in the first place. So this is a good power as well. There's also food inspection. There's the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which enforces the standards that the federal government lays out for food. There's a couple pieces of legislation. There's really only two, which is kind of shocking given the number of animals we kill for food in Canada each year. But at the federal level, there's the Health of Animals Act and the Meat Inspection Act. And these pieces of legislation have a lot more to do with food safety than animal welfare or protection. They essentially don't really care about the animal's condition at all unless it pertains to human health and eating animals and their flesh. So that's one other area. There's also fisheries and oceans. So marine mammals fall under this area. That's why the federal government has control over the seal hunt, things like whaling, and any other fisheries issue. And then there's endangered species and migratory birds is another area that they work on. We have federal legislation and we're engaged in a number of treaties at the federal level. So moving on to provincial government, this is where a lot of the action actually happens. And the reason for this is that because provinces are empowered by the Constitution to make laws about property. And as we all know, animals are mere property under the eyes of the law. So provinces can make a lot of really specific laws about animals, more so than the federal government. Federal government usually needs some area of national concern to ground their power. But provinces can do a lot more. So a lot of provinces have actually brought in their own, well, all of them have brought in their own cruelty provisions to supplement the ones in the criminal code. And this is because the criminal code is so woefully inadequate to protect animals. It's really difficult to secure a conviction, and the legislation is just really outdated. It hasn't been meaningfully updated since the 1800s. So I know we've seen this recently in BC with the strengthened animal protection provisions around sled dogs in response to that massacre. Hunting and fishing is another area that the provinces regulate. They can also do work on endangered species. They can set standards for farm animals, for fur farms, for animal experimentation, and standards for animals used in labs, zoos and other exhibits. So generally they have a lot of power to pass laws. So provinces are great areas on which to focus attention. And finally, we've got the municipal level, so cities and other municipalities and smaller towns. They can do things that are pretty similar to the provinces, but it depends a lot on what province you're in. They each have their own kind of grant of power from the province to the cities, so it's important to check things out. I checked out the BC legislation a little bit last night, and not an expert on it, but from what I can understand, BC municipalities can regulate and regulate the keeping of any animal, so that includes companion animals, backyard chickens, exotic animals that might come in circuses. They have powers over animal licensing, like dog licensing, dangerous dogs. There's also pounds and sheltering and seizure of stray animals. So a lot of the local issues are directly ruled by the municipalities. Local sales as well are important, so councils can actually prohibit the sale of animals in some circumstances. Toronto recently did this with the sale of cats and dogs in pet stores, and I know that I believe it was Richmond as well did this not too long ago. So in these communities now, it's not allowed to sell pets, to sell cats and dogs through pet stores. And the reason for that is that they all come from puppy and kitten mills. And instead, they're encouraged to work with shelters to adopt those dogs out through the shelter system. So this is a really positive change for animals. Another thing regarding sales is, of course, the shark fin bans that we've seen in Ontario. So Toronto and a whole host of other municipalities in Ontario have prohibited the sale of shark fins within their jurisdictions. And I think we're going to see that coming to BC pretty soon. I know a lot of people are starting to work on that in Vancouver. So that's a general overview of what the different levels of government in Canada can do. And I think one of the striking differences between Canada and a lot of other jurisdictions is that so much of what we do here towards animals is simply unregulated. We just have a lot fewer laws on the books than other jurisdictions do. So some states have laws that regulate, really specific aspects of the way that we use animals. But in Canada, we often don't. So this is a problem, but it's also an opportunity for us to get in there and try to fill in some of those gaps. So with those basics out of the way, I want to talk a little bit about how we can start going about getting what we want from the politicians who we elect. Remember that they're there to serve us, and they should be responsive to our needs. So I want to discuss the art of political campaigning and lobbying a little bit, and share some ideas on strategy and tactics. And then finish up with some practical tips. So political lobbying it's kind of a bit of a specialized skill set. In some ways it's not very intuitive. We may have intuitive ideas about how to reach out to people appropriately and change hearts and minds on the street, but political campaigning is a bit different in that you need to have an idea of how the legislative process works and what really motivates politicians. And understanding these things will help us be most effective. So at its most basic, the idea behind political lobbying and campaigning is that we are asking someone to do something. We're asking politicians to improve life for animals. And in order to get what we want, we have to understand what lawmakers and politicians find persuasive, what will motivate them to give us what we want. It would be really, really nice if they were all motivated by doing the right thing. And not to say that there aren't some of them out there who are, because there are a lot of good people in politics who truly want to do something better for animals. But a lot of the time they aren't, and even sometimes when they are, they have other pressures on them. So, if everyone simply did the right thing all the time when they knew they should, we wouldn't be here today. So the reality is that they're juggling competing interests. They have to make priorities, and sometimes they prioritize other needs over the needs of animals. Not sometimes, usually. So when we sit down with them, we will have had to do our homework. We can present them with fact sheets, we can present them with solid information and research, and we can appeal to them with reasons about why they should get on board with our issues. But I would argue that it's not enough to simply appeal to a person's sense of right and wrong, because they do have so many other competing considerations. So to be most effective in getting what we want, I think we need to show them why it's in their own self-interest to do what we're asking them to do. This will greatly increase our chances of successful lobbying. So what essentially boils down to is showing politicians that people like us who care about animals are a political force to be reckoned with. We have to show them that we have political capital and that they must listen to us for this reason. So thinking about what motivates lawmakers to act, they have some of the same motivations as the rest of us. Many of them want to do the right thing. They generally want to be liked by people. They usually want to make decisions that accord well with their conscience. But most of all, what they want is to get reelected. Politicians make choices that greatly increase the chance of their getting reelected, and conversely, they're going to avoid making decisions if they think it might cost them their political futures. So always remember that they're motivated by being reelected, and on the flip side of the coin, never forget that they fear losing elections. So I think what we need to do to be most persuasive is to show the lawmakers that we hold enough political capital to either help them get reelected or to help them be defeated if we don't like what they're doing. If we make the issue about them and their political future, it's harder to ignore us. So this is a tried and true technique for getting political results, and it's one that's used in campaigns on every level. I'm not sure if how many of you are aware of many details about the Ontario campaign to end the spring bear hunt in the 90s, but this is a tactic that was used really successfully in that campaign. So essentially, I know that's an issue in BC as well, is bear hunting, especially in the spring. But basically, hunters were killing mother bears who just emerged from hibernation and who had young cubs, and the cubs were being orphaned. So a lot of people in Ontario were rightfully very concerned about this and began campaigning to try to put an end to the spring bear hunt. And the government of the time, it was a conservative government, was very resistant to this at first. But what shifted and what ultimately brought about the victory in that campaign was that they began to fear that animal advocates would be going after them in really closely contested races in the next election. And they were worried that we could make the difference between them winning the next election and them losing the next election. So as soon as they realized that, they flipped, and we put an end to the spring bear hunt in Ontario. So this technique works. So how do we show politicians that we're a force worth listening to? Here are a few things that we can do. One really great tactic is to form a voting bloc, essentially. So this is a way of demonstrating to the politicians that we have enough support to make a difference to them in their electoral futures. So we do this by becoming ultra-organized and mobilizing our supporters, keeping really great lists of who's on board with our issues. So we can gather names, we can present petitions around certain issues, and so on. And the more names of supporters that we gather, the more political capital that we have in their minds. We tell the politicians that we're able to mobilize our supporters on election day and between elections. And we can issue endorsements if there are candidates that we like. We can urge our supporters to go and vote for those candidates who are good on issues. And conversely, we can urge them to vote against those who are bad on issues. We can use our supporters between elections on issues as well. If a politician knows that by supporting animal issues between elections, they're more likely to get our support during elections, then that helps nudge them in the right direction. It's also really important to do things like work on their campaigns. Send our supporters out maybe to door knock for them for the day. Send them to their campaign offices to help out where they can. And we can even encourage people to donate to such and such a candidate if we think that they're good on issues. And when we do this, it's important to let the politicians know that we're donating to them and that we're working for them because of their stance or their expected stance on an animal issue. So this is a good reminder for them that people care about those issues, and it makes them feel indebted to us. They know that they won an election because of the help of people who care about animals, and therefore they're more likely to support our issues in the future. This idea of forming a constituency of voters who will vote on animal issues is something that was also used really effectively in the Toronto campaign to ban shark fins. So what people did was gather thousands and thousands, I'm not sure of the final number, but I think it was well over 10,000 names on a petition calling for Toronto City Councillors to ban shark fins. And when the movement was first launched, we really had no idea how the vote was going to go at City Council. We knew that there were some councillors who were prepared to support banning shark fin, but we knew that there were others who perhaps had populations in their wards that would resist this. So the way we used those lists of supporters is to break it down by ward with their address and say to politicians who were kind of swing votes that we weren't sure which way they were going to go, to say, we've got X thousand names on a petition in your ward, and we'll be telling these people about your stance on the issue of shark fin. So we encourage you to vote for the motion to ban shark fin. And in the end, it worked really well. We won that campaign with a vote of 38-4 on City Council. So this type of technique is highly effective. When they can see those names and they have addresses attached to them, they realize that these are real people who can vote for them or vote against them. Another thing we can do is get more aggressive and target individual politicians for defeat in certain elections, and for bad public relations and bad PR, essentially, between elections. So we can do this in a few different ways, and some ideas include taking out low-cost ads in community newspapers, Facebook campaigns, web ads. But showing them that we're prepared to devote resources to improving or conversely diminishing their reputation based on their actions on animal issues is another important way of showing them that we are a force that should be listened to. No politician likes taking flack from the public between elections, and no politician likes losing elections. So a third thing we can do is start working now to elect more animal-friendly politicians in the first place. Of course, it's important to lobby the ones that we already have, but come election time, I think it's really important that we work to make sure that the people who get elected are on board with our issues. Even if the candidates that we support don't win, it signals to the other candidates and those who are ultimately victorious that there are people out there who care about those issues, and that if they were to take a stronger stance on an animal rights issue, that those people would start to move over from them, towards them. So, it's a political calculation for them in a sense, but I think it's one that pays off because they want to move that support towards them. Especially in Canada, most elections here, except for BC municipal elections, they're fought under a first-past-the-post system, which is where the winner takes all. So oftentimes it can really come down to just a few votes, and the politician who's able to garner votes from another candidate because of an animal issue is one who could sneak ahead in the polls and potentially win. So they're always kind of vying and jockeying for those issues that will help them win. So, supporting politicians and putting forward our own candidates in political races, it's great if we win. So we may have the effect of actually electing MPs or MLAs or city councillors, or even at the student government level or within other elected bodies. We might actually elect some of our own. But even if we don't, we're showing out them, the other candidates and parties, that they can attract votes by adopting more animal-friendly policies, because there are simply people out there who care enough to vote on those issues. So those are some of the ways that we can demonstrate to politicians that we have political capital. And I just want to now briefly go over some helpful tips for what happens when you're actually ready to start campaigning on an issue. So say the election is over and you've got politicians who you want to lobby now. What are you going to do? So first of all, decide upon your issue. Pick one. You have to focus in on one particular thing, and not go into a meeting with just a general sense that you want better laws for animals, but you have to choose one specific thing that you want. So choose a goal that's achievable in scope. What do you want to accomplish, and what will a victory look like for you? So this analysis should kind of ground your path forward. Keep in mind that there are different types of victories. Some victories have an immediate effect on animals. So, for example, Richmond banning sales of cats and dogs in pet stores. That's something that has an immediate effect. But there are other victories that have a more symbolic yet equally important effect. So, for example, West Hollywood in Los Angeles recently banned all sales of fur within their city limits. And this is something that doesn't have a huge impact on animals, because the fur stores will shift elsewhere, and there wasn't really much fur to be being sold in the first place in West Hollywood. But it signals to other communities that fur is not acceptable, and it helps pave the path for other municipalities to perhaps do the same. So next thing you want to do is choose your target. You need to choose the appropriate lawmaker, someone who actually has the power to do what you want them to do. So think about who you need to convince to come around to your position. Is it a committee of city council or parliament? Is it an individual lawmaker, an entire council, an entire party? Is it a party leader? Is it members of the cabinet? Think about who has the power to implement the changes that you want. Then you have to think about the ask. What is it that you're going to ask your target to do? It's best to choose an achievable, manageable goal that's really, really clear. So do you want them to bring up your issue at a committee meeting? Do you want them to actually propose legislation? Do you want them to just simply talk about the issue with others in their party to get them used to the idea? Do you want them to attend an event you're hosting and make a public speech in support of an issue? Table a petition in the House of Commons about your issue? So it's important to choose something that's achievable and manageable for them, that they can do without putting further thought into it. You lay it out to them what you want them to do. And finally, what method will you use to accomplish this? So will it be a letter writing campaign? Will it be a face-to-face meeting with them? Will it be a media campaign to give them good PR or bad PR? You can use kind of a carrot and a stick approach here. Or is it a combination of all these tactics? So it's important to choose the one that you think will be most effective towards your target. And when it comes to actually sitting down and meeting with a politician, here's another list of a couple helpful tips. So first of all, do as much background research on your target as you possibly can. Read their website, read their bios, find out what motivates them, find out what issues they've championed in the past. Do a Google News search for their name and look for comments they've made in the media. You want to find out if they've supported similar initiatives to yours, if they have particular issues that they care about, what their voting record was, and so on. The more information you have, the better prepared you'll be to appeal to what interests them in your meeting. Never make assumptions about what a politician might support, Animal issues are unique in that there's cross-party support for all of them. So it's not always a left or a right thing. You might find more people on the left that care about animals, but then again, sometimes it surprises me, people in supposedly progressive parties who just don't care at all. And then you might have someone in the more right-wing party who really cares. So never make assumptions that because someone's in such and such a party that they will or will not care about your issue. It's always great to find that out directly from them. So keep records of the contact and the meetings that you have with politicians and with their staff. The staff are really important. It's a really good idea to befriend these staffers. Be courteous and polite with them on the phone. Try to develop a personal relationship because they're really the gatekeepers towards the people with actual power. And they can make your life better, or they can make it worse if they don't like you. Send short, concise emails and leave short, concise voicemail messages. Biggest tip, never use all capitals in an email to someone. It just makes you look crazy. Use proper grammar and spelling too. It helps bolster your credibility. So when you're sitting down with them and when you're preparing your background material, you want to link the campaign to your target's interests. And because you will have already done your homework by this point, you'll know what motivates them. So does your target have a demonstrated interest in environmental issues? If they do, you can use that to ground your ask. So you can show them why what you want to do is also great for the environment, as well as being good for animals. Be credible, so rely on facts as much as you can as opposed to rhetoric. Get all the information you need before you meet with them and present it really clearly and professionally to them, and leave them with a one-page summary of what you're discussing and what your ask is so that they have that to look at later on. Be powerful. This kind of goes with the idea of showing them that we have political support. Show that we have the weight of important constituencies of voters behind us. Sometimes it's helpful to have a lot of letters from community leaders to bring into a meeting with them, or sometimes it's helpful to have a lot of letters simply from their constituents. Or it might be more effective to have just a few letters, but a few letters from really important people who hold a lot of power within their area. Be respectful of their time. Ask them up front how much time they have for this meeting and stick within those boundaries. When you're in the meeting as well, respect their varying levels of knowledge about your issue. Sometimes they know all about the issue. And there's nothing worse than a politician sitting down with someone who's, and this person's well-versed on the issue, and the lobbyist proceeds to tell them all about it for 30 minutes before getting to the ask. So it's good to find out what their background level of knowledge is on your issue. You can ask them up front how much they know and how much they'd like you to explain to them. And final tip is always be respectful and polite, even if they disagree with you. They might not come on board with you for this issue, but you might need them in the future for another one. Simply because they don't support one issue doesn't mean that they won't be good on another one. So always try to maintain that relationship by being a pleasant and respectful and polite person. Okay, so that pretty much concludes what I wanted to tell you. Some tips on how to be a successful lobbyist and why I think it's important that we as a movement get more political in Canada. So I think in general we're starting to ramp up efforts in Canada to do more for animals. We've got new groups popping up all the time. I feel like veganism is growing exponentially, and the scene here is just starting to explode. So what I really want is to make sure that political efforts are part of that. Back there?
You mentioned letters and emails. Do you mean letters, handwritten letters compared to emails, or are they all the same? Because I used to hear that one written letter was equal to like 10. Is that sort of comparative, or?
Yeah, well, that's a great point. So I was speaking more about letters from community leaders that would be individualistic, but there are often campaigns where we have like a form on the internet, and you can fill it in, and it'll send a form email to a legislator. So those are good, except if you have the option to write something in your own words, that means a lot more, like you were saying, to somebody who receives that letter. So a politician will give that a lot more weight if they see that somebody has put the actual time into writing out their thoughts, instead of just clicking through the steps on the website to send a form letter. So if you can, encourage your supporters to send their own personal letters, because they will pay off.
And you mean personal letters, changing the formatted letters on email, but what about a is handwritten letters any more visible than an email, even if it is personalized?
I don't know that I'd say that they're necessarily more persuasive. Sometimes it's easier to organize them by email for the politician staffers. In practice, I think they usually print a lot of them off anyways. So, you know, I'd say go with whatever is more comfortable. If you can do fun things like get kids to send in handwritten letters, now that would be worth its weight in gold. Yeah.
One of the things we're struggling with animal research in BC is the law of unintended consequences. That if we were to pass, say, an Animal Welfare Act at the federal level or provincial level, that UBC, for example, could claim that we have bigger cages now and toys for the animals. And so we could convince the public that the issue is solved. The other problem is that, and I applaud what's happening in Toronto, the University of Toronto announcing their concern with primates, but what they also said is they've shifted the burden too far to smaller animals. So what we worry about is if we go after the cat experiments or primate experiments in BC, they would just simply shift that to rats and mice, frogs and other animals. So it's a very difficult issue. I think what's probably more effective for animal research in general in Canada is to beef up the freedom of information laws because we can't get access to information.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's important to be really strategic about the legislation that we decide to push for. So like Brian said, sometimes we've got unintended consequences where we think something's going to be really great for animals, but maybe it's a really bad piece of legislation, but in the public's mind, that's put forward, the problem is solved, and we move on to something else. So a good example of this is the criminal code. So various animal groups have been trying to amend the criminal code cruelty provisions for decades now. They're just so atrocious and outdated. But what's happened is, you know, we've put forward this really good bill, and it keeps getting shut down by the Senate. But the Senate put forward its own really bad bill that just increased the penalties but didn't solve the underlying problems. And they passed that, and now, because they've passed that, people have kind of forgotten about it. They're like, oh yeah, you know, we did something about cruelty recently, so we can move on from that issue. So yeah, sometimes passing a bad piece of legislation that's flawed is worse than passing nothing at all. I agree. Yeah?
I definitely agree with Brian and what you said. I live in the United States when we have the Animal Welfare Act that regulates the use of some species of animals in experimentation. And we all acknowledge, I mean, it's a major talking point that it's basically, it governs housekeeping of animals, size of cage, things of that nature. But when it comes to the actual experimentation, anything goes. But even as we criticize how useless the animal, I shouldn't say useless, but how weak the Animal Welfare Act is, it's also a major tool for us. So I work at CUDA, and when we do undercover investigations inside laboratories, my job is to go through the investigators' notes and video footage and figure out where the non-compliances are, where the violations are with the Animal Welfare Act. And when we found these complaints, you know, that's what really pushes media stories on it. It was the institution observing animals under scrutiny, gives them a hard time, there are fines, citations, so even laws that aren't what we really want, we like to see the version obviously, but even when you're not there, they do offer some tools to push.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the reality is that we're stuck with many of the laws that we have, and in some cases there just won't be political appetite to change those for some time. So what we can do to increase that appetite is expose the flaws in those laws. And I think one of the reasons that things like undercover investigations are so important is that they create the public awareness that politicians need to see before they're motivated to act on something and actually change the law. So it's a good example of how the public awareness campaigns really work hand in hand with the political ones, and how you really can't have one without the other. You need to raise the public to a level where they're demanding something before, well, to make it a lot easier to get what you want from a politician. Yeah. Anyone else? Oh, hey.
I was just curious, you mentioned a few times that it's good to get letters from influential people in the community, and who would those people be? What sorts of people?
Anybody who represents a group that has some kind of political power is helpful. So say you've got the chair of a business improvement association for a neighborhood, and that person was really in favor of ending cat and dog sales in pet stores. That would be super helpful. If you've got a residents association or a community council in your area, a letter from a person that's involved with that would be helpful. Any type of community group, really. But the key is to go after people who represent others, so that their letter on their own can be seen as coming from, 300 of their members in your community. And that's why it holds more weight. It's because it's on behalf of so many other people in your area. Yeah.
I read recently about, just as far as animals property goes, I read recently about how Europe, that animals are classified as non-human persons or something to that effect. And I wondered if you knew anything about that, and also what your view might be on what an ideal, something that we could work toward as far as how animals can be, because obviously, they're not going to be, considered persons under the law just because of differences, but so what can we work toward, and, let's go away from doing animals property in the classroom.
Right. I could be wrong, and maybe someone in this room knows more about this than I have. I think I read about it, but I can't remember the details now. I think what you're talking about in terms of non-human property or non-human persons might be in Spain, where they declared that higher primates fall into that category. But
For Africa, it was in New Zealand for some of them, but it was all over the EU for the privates.
okay, right. Yeah, so there's movement in some jurisdictions away from animals as mere property with no more rights in this table. Just, they both share 4 legs, and that's about the only characteristic, yet they're still property. So, I think there's more awareness that that's an issue. And one thing I think will be really instrumental in doing that is the types of litigation that we are starting to see now. So I'm sure most of you heard about PETA's suit against SeaWorld in the United States, claiming that SeaWorld was violating the US Constitution because the animals were enslaved. So that's the type of litigation that sort of challenges the system and challenges the way we think about animals as property and whether they should actually be thought of as persons. And that failed. It was rejected by a judge, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying those types of things. So I think, again, this is an issue where public awareness has to go hand in hand with political lobbying, but also using the courts, especially in this issue, because it's a really sort of narrow legal issue in a sense. It's the law, basically, that defines animals as property. And if we can put forward those types of legal challenges that really question whether that's an appropriate status, the more we do, the more we shift the dialogue towards what we need in terms of the way, instead of the way things have been. So I think it's important to keep challenging it through new types of litigation, to raise awareness about the craziness of treating animals no differently than a table and chair, and asking our politicians for better. So it's really going to be a 3-pronged approach, I think, towards abolishing the property status of animals. Yeah. One more question? Anyone? Yeah.
I'm just wondering, you talked about how in Toronto, it was the shark fin banning in Toronto, and also with the spring bear hunt. Did one environmental group or some group take charge kind of that issue and then sort of bring other groups into the fold? Because the movement really is as strong as kind of this how it can coordinate itself. And there has to be, whether it's in the center or the top or whatever, there has to be organization. So, and then mobilization of people and groups. So can you talk a bit about, that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, actually. That's a good thing to touch on. You're right, it was a coordinated effort in both of those campaigns. And coincidentally, it happens to be one of the same person who kind of was the brains behind the scene in both of those campaigns. A really great campaigner who lives in Ontario, and he's worked on a lot of wildlife campaigns in particular. So the take-home message from these campaigns that have been, highly successful in the case of the spring bear hunt, and on their way to being successful on, you know, a city scale, possibly a provincial scale, and hopefully a national scale eventually for the shark fin issue. I think the take-home message is that we do need to be super coordinated, we need to be highly organized, and we need to be really strategic in the steps that we take on those campaigns. So it was no accident that Brantford, Ontario decided to put forward that motion that kicked off all of the subsequent council decisions to ban shark fin in Ontario. That was a coordinated idea to start at the municipal level and work our way up to the provincial and then the national levels. So yeah, to be most effective, we really have to think about what steps are most strategic along the way to take. And that requires organization, and it does require some coordination between groups and individuals who are working on the issues. You know, the more we put our heads together and the more we use our collective knowledge, the better results we'll get for animals. Great. All right, well, thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure.